After months of speculation and rumor, the royal family confirmed today that Kate is in the very early stages of pregnancy.
Behind the silent walls of Kensington, one whispered line changed everything and brought a future king to tears. For months, the air around the palace had been thick with speculation, quiet murmurs of hope and fear, but no certainty. Every glance at Catherine, every rare public appearance, was dissected by millions searching for answers. And yet, inside those ancient walls, no word had come. Until now, it was here in a private chamber, with no cameras, no royal aides clamoring for statements, that the truth was finally spoken aloud. Just William, Catherine, and a handful of doctors sat together, bracing for what they would hear. The doctors looked at Catherine's charts one last time before speaking, their voices calm but heavy with meaning. They told her she was doing well, and then came the words that seemed to hang in the air like a prayer answered. Due January 2026. For the first time in months, the world outside faded away. The air felt different, still but electric, as though even the walls understood the weight of what had just been said. William blinked, glanced at Catherine, then turned his head sharply, as if to compose himself. A single whispered line slipped from his lips, barely audible but deafening in its relief. "Thank God she's safe." In that fragile silence, the weight of everything they had endured finally caught up to him. His eyes shimmered, the dam he'd built within himself, breaking at last. Months of sleepless nights, of putting on a steady face for the cameras, of hiding his terror behind formal smiles. It all cracked open in that instant. He'd been holding everything back for so long, not for himself, but for her, for the children, for the country. Yet here, away from the gaze of the world, he let it fall. The tears came quietly, not from fear anymore, but from an overwhelming rush of gratitude. Catherine, sensing his walls crumbling, reached across the small table and took his hand in hers. The doctor continued to speak softly in the background, but neither of them heard. It was just them now. No crown, no cameras, only two people who had walked through fire and found their way back to each other. William turned and kissed her forehead, gently, like a man finally letting himself breathe after drowning for too long. A faint, unspoken promise passed between them in that touch, that no matter what lay ahead, they were no longer fighting in the dark. But the journey to that fragile joy was carved through shadows, a storm few could ever imagine. Before hope blossomed, they endured a storm that no crown could shield them from. The world remembers Catherine as a symbol of poise and quiet strength, but few truly grasped the depths of her suffering in those dark months of 2024. When the announcement finally came that she was stepping away from royal duties to undergo treatment for cancer, it landed like a thunderclap over Buckingham Palace. For years, she had carried herself as the unwavering heart of the monarchy, but behind closed doors, her body was fighting a silent war. The diagnosis was as cruel as it was unexpected, stripping away not only her public presence, but the illusion of invincibility that clung to the royal family. As she vanished from the spotlight, public concern morphed into fear. The press speculated relentlessly. Where was she? How bad was it? Each passing week without her smile only deepened the sense of unease, and while the cameras panned across palace gates, hoping for even a glimpse, Catherine endured her treatments in privacy, her absence deafening to a nation that adored her. The palace maintained its silence, but inside those gilded walls, her struggle was anything but quiet. The doctors spoke plainly. The chances of her carrying another child, they warned, were slim. Her body, weakened by the brutal realities of treatment, would not easily withstand the toll of pregnancy. The words cut deeper than anyone could see. To Catherine, motherhood had never been just duty. It was her sanctuary, her greatest joy, and now even that seemed at risk. William listened to every word, forcing himself to nod, to remain steady, even as his hands curled tightly behind his back to mask their trembling. He had spent years perfecting that facade of composure, but nothing could disguise the anguish churning beneath it. The strong, dutiful prince the world expected him to be was slowly unraveling in private. At public appearances, his smile never faltered, his voice never cracked, but late at night, he would sit alone, staring at the faint glow of Catherine's hospital room, willing himself to believe she would recover, even as doubt gnawed at him. When whispers of a pregnancy began to circulate, quiet murmurs heard only by the closest aides, they were met with disbelief. How could it be possible? William himself refused to speak of it at first, afraid that naming the hope aloud might shatter it. Even as doctors confirmed the possibility, they cautioned restraint, reminding him of the fragility of both Catherine's health and the life growing inside her. And so, in the earliest weeks, they told no one, not even family. In those days, hope and fear wove themselves together so tightly it was impossible to separate them. Every fleeting smile was tempered by worry. Every quiet night carried both gratitude and dread. Yet, in the midst of this storm, the darkest and most relentless of their lives, something extraordinary was taking shape. And yet, with each quiet heartbeat, hope began to grow, and with it, whispers of a miracle. Even as silence blanketed the palace, one tiny heartbeat grew louder each day. Within the ancient walls of Windsor, where whispers rarely carried beyond the corridors, something fragile and miraculous was quietly unfolding. Every few days, Catherine returned to her doctors, each visit another test of faith. They watched her closely, measuring every detail, ensuring both mother and child were weathering the storm. There was no room for error, no space for complacency. The stakes could not have been higher, and yet, with every reassuring word from her physicians, the shadow over the family began to lift, if only slightly. The sound of that heartbeat, steady, defiant, became their secret lifeline, a reminder that hope was not just possible but real, but that hope did not come without its price. Catherine's body, already battered from the trials of her illness, now bore the cruel weight of hyperemesis gravidarum once again. It was no ordinary sickness. These were relentless, consuming, and merciless days when she could not stand, hours when even the faintest smell or taste left her broken and hollow. It drained her strength in ways words could never capture, leaving her confined to bed, clinging to moments of fleeting relief. And yet, even through this, she endured. She reached back to familiar comforts from her earlier pregnancies, finding solace in the smallest rituals. Brown toast, dry and plain, became her companion. Avocados offered her a quiet strength when nothing else would stay down. And once more, the homemade curry prepared by the same devoted couple who had cooked for her during George's arrival warmed her from within, carrying her through the darkest hours. These were not merely foods, they were reminders of resilience, fragments of normalcy she could still control. Even as her body waged its quiet battle, Catherine turned to another ally, hypnobirthing. This was not just about pain or distraction. It was her way of reclaiming her power, of reminding herself that this pregnancy was hers to shape. Through deliberate breath, through whispered mantras in the stillness of night, she fought to find calm where her body gave her none. It became her armor, invisible but unbreakable, shielding her mind when her body could not. And so she withdrew from the world. The public, who hungered for glimpses of her, waited in vain. There were no grand appearances, no flashing cameras, only the quiet rhythm of her recovery, carried out within the sanctuary of her home. Her world grew smaller: doctors, William, the children, her own quiet determination, but inside that circle, her strength grew larger than anyone could imagine. But then came the question no one dared to ask aloud. If it's a girl, would they choose the one name that could shake the monarchy to its core? When the name surfaced, the air itself seemed to stop Diana. In the quiet aftermath of the doctor's reassurances, another revelation came that would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. Insiders, sworn to silence but unable to conceal their awe, confirmed what William and Catherine had already begun to suspect: the baby was very likely a girl. Those words carried more than the promise of a daughter. They carried the weight of history, the memory of a woman whose legacy still haunted every corner of the monarchy. For a long moment, William and Catherine exchanged no words, only a glance that said everything. And then Catherine spoke, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We know what her name has to be." There was no debate between them, no hesitation. The name had always been waiting, unspoken but alive in their hearts. It wasn't just about honoring a memory. It was about restoring something that had been lost, about reaching back through time and stitching together the past with the future. The silence that followed her declaration was not of doubt, but of something deeper, something sacred. William, eyes misty and jaw tight, simply nodded. But beyond the intimacy of that agreement, not everyone shared their certainty. Camilla, insiders say, was among the first to voice her unease. To resurrect the name Diana was to reopen wounds many within the palace believed had long since been sealed. Advisors worried it would reignite comparisons, drag old ghosts into new headlines, and risk overshadowing Catherine herself. Behind closed doors, whispers of dissent grew louder, some even cautioning that the choice could fracture the fragile peace that the family had worked so hard to preserve. Yet the world beyond those gilded gates had no such reservations. When the possibility of the name leaked, it ignited a kind of fervor unseen in years. Across Britain and beyond, the public responded with overwhelming warmth. There was nostalgia. Yes, memories of the woman who had captivated and comforted millions, but there was also something more: hope. For them, the name Diana was not just a tribute, but a promise. A promise that her spirit, her humanity, her quiet rebellion, would live on in the next generation. As speculation mounted, the name they considered in full began circulating: Diana Elizabeth Charlotte Windsor. A name that carried not just history, but love. It honored a grandmother's grace, a mother's strength, and a nation's devotion. And for William and Catherine, it became more than a choice. It became their way of reclaiming a story that had once ended in tragedy, and rewriting it with joy. Inside the Wales home, the choice brought peace and purpose as the children began preparing for their sister's arrival. For the first time in months, the halls of their home filled with laughter again. After so many long weeks of hushed conversations and heavy silences, the Wales household began to feel alive once more. George, Charlotte, and Louis, who had quietly carried their own small share of worry, finally had something bright to hold on to. The news of a baby sister lit a spark in them, and their joy spilled into every corner of the home. George, thoughtful and protective as ever, asked serious questions about how he could help, as if preparing himself for the responsibilities of an older brother all over again. But it was Charlotte who brought a kind of magic into the air, declaring with total confidence that the baby should be named Sparkle or Butterfly. Names so whimsical they made Catherine smile for the first time in weeks. And then there was Louis, still too young to understand the enormity of it all, but old enough to feel the change. He carefully drew a picture of the baby, proudly scribbling "Baby Sister Diana" across the page, then taping it to the refrigerator where everyone could see. That quiet storm of sadness that had hung over the family began to lift, replaced by giggles, chatter, and the sound of little feet running through the halls. William and Catherine made the deliberate choice to bring the children into the preparations, letting them help pick out books for the nursery, suggest colors for the walls, even choose tiny toys they thought their sister might like. It wasn't just about readying a room, it was about rebuilding the bonds that fear and illness had strained. Together, they transformed the nursery into something more than a space. It became a symbol of healing, of their shared determination to move forward as a family. The atmosphere inside the home began to soften. What had once felt like a fortress of worry became a sanctuary of calm. Meals were shared without lingering glances of concern. Bedtime stories became longer and sillier, and even Catherine's tiredness no longer seemed to weigh so heavily. They were finally able to feel like themselves again, not just royals carrying a burden, but a family savoring every fragile, precious moment of peace. Through it all, William and Catherine made a quiet but unwavering decision. This time, their love and togetherness would come before everything else. Royal duties, obligations, appearances, none of it mattered as much as this fleeting chapter of joy. The cameras outside could wait, the critics could murmur, the expectations of the monarchy could hold. Inside their walls, they were just a husband, a wife, and parents who had survived a storm and were ready to embrace the calm. But as joy returned to the household, William faced a different storm outside the crown's shadow, growing closer each day. Before he is a prince or king, he is simply Dad, and nothing means more. For all the titles that cling to his name and the expectations that weigh on his shoulders, William's truest role has never been written in ceremony. It lives in quiet moments in the bedtime stories he insists on reading himself, in the school runs that make him just another parent among the crowd, in the weekend soccer games where he shouts encouragement from the sidelines. He has always refused to let the crown come between him and his children, refusing to let royal tradition dictate what kind of father he should be. Where past generations kept their distance, William leaned in. Where they let duty overshadow love, he chose the opposite. This new baby, however, was different. This child, born of struggle and silence, felt to him like a second chance, not only at happiness, but at healing something in himself he didn't even fully understand. The news of her coming struck him harder than anyone could have imagined. In the sterile calm of the doctor's office, when those words finally came that both mother and child were safe, and that she would arrive in January, the weight of it all broke through the walls he had built. His whispered prayer of thanks was more than gratitude. It was released. For once, he allowed himself to simply feel, to let the tears fall, not as a prince or even a husband, but as a father whose heart could no longer bear the silence. Parenting has always been his quiet rebellion. When the world demanded that he harden himself in preparation for the throne, he softened instead. When critics questioned his involvement in the mundane tasks of family life, he ignored them. To him, being truly present was not optional. It was sacred. Whether cleaning out the children's guinea pig cage because they'd forgotten again, or kneeling on the nursery floor late at night just to hear them breathe, William treated fatherhood not as an obligation but as the essence of who he was. This baby only deepened that conviction. Knowing he would get to hold her, to guide her through the world from her very first breath, gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Even as the monarchy's demands grew louder, he clung to that vision of himself, not in uniform or crown, but sitting cross-legged on the floor with all 4 of his children, just a father doing what fathers do. That is why the tears that day were so raw, so powerful, because in that moment, everything else fell away, leaving only love. But beyond the nursery walls, a much larger role was waiting, and the weight of destiny was closing in fast. As one life begins, another reign nears its end, and the palace holds its breath. While the Wales household brimmed with the warmth of anticipation, the air beyond those private rooms felt colder, heavier, and charged with uncertainty. Whispers rippled through the palace corridors, whispers about the king's health, about how long he could maintain his duties, about whether the transition everyone feared yet expected was already quietly underway. Rumors suggested that his illness was not only persistent but insidious, with even his most loyal advisors unable to quell the doubts that hung over his reign. There was a feeling now that time, once generous, was running thin, and everyone knew who the world's eyes would turn to next. Behind closed doors, senior aides began to speak of William, not just as heir but as imminent successor. They noted how the public, even without official word, had already begun to look to him and Catherine as the true center of the monarchy's future. And it was no longer simply admiration, it was expectation. In every poll, in every column, their names rose while others faded, their image solidifying as the monarchy's best hope of surviving this precarious chapter. What was once a distant inevitability now loomed as a pressing reality, and William could feel its weight pressing closer with each passing day. The irony was not lost on him. The very moment he was preparing to welcome a child to begin a new chapter of fatherhood and healing, the crown was creeping toward him faster than he could have imagined. The baby's due date, now fixed in January, seemed almost symbolic. It fell precisely in the window palace insiders believed could coincide with dramatic changes to the throne. The thought of navigating both fatherhood to a fragile newborn and leadership of an ancient institution was staggering. Yet there was no time for hesitation. Already, decisions about public appearances, state papers, and delicate succession strategies were finding their way to him. Still, in public, William wore the same calm composure that had become his signature. He smiled when expected, shook hands, delivered speeches, all while an undercurrent of tension pulled at him relentlessly. The quiet moments, however, revealed the strain. Those closest to him saw how often his gaze would drift to Catherine, as though reminding himself of what truly mattered when the crown became too heavy to bear. And as the speculation grew louder, the press began writing of the couple as the monarchy's beating heart, not just for their youth and humanity, but because they carried the trust of a weary public who longed for something steady to believe in. William understood what was coming. He could feel it in the way people spoke to him now, not just as heir, but as a man already stepping into the void. He braced himself silently, knowing he could not afford to falter, not for his family, not for his country. And through it all, one figure remained by his side, unshakable, graceful, quietly defiant. She returned to the world, not as a victim, but as a warrior. When Catherine finally re-emerged into the public eye, it was not with the fragility that so many had expected. Though her body still bore the weight of her illness and her pregnancy, there was a quiet fire in her that no sickness could extinguish. The months of silence had not broken her. They had forged her into something even stronger. While the world had imagined her hidden away, crumbling under the relentless toll of cancer, she had been fighting quietly, privately, with a determination that defied everything whispered about her. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to abandon the causes that mattered most to her. Even in her weakest moments, she insisted on staying involved in family life and the royal projects she had nurtured over the years. Those closest to her say she managed her days like a general, allocating her limited strength to her children, her recovery, and her duties in careful balance. On paper, it looked impossible, but Catherine never asked whether it could be done. She simply did it. When she made her appearance at Trooping the Color, the crowd gasped, not because she looked perfect, but because she was there. Standing in defiance of her body's pain, she made it clear without a word that she would not allow the challenges to define her. To stand there under the scrutiny of the world, with the weight of her unborn child and her own fragility, was a victory few could understand. That day, she reminded everyone watching that strength does not always roar. Sometimes, it shows itself in the willingness to stand when every muscle screams to collapse. Her resolve did not go unnoticed. Public admiration for her swelled into something larger than sympathy. People began to see her not just as a duchess or a princess, but as a woman who had weathered storms many could not imagine and still carried herself with grace. Letters poured into the palace. Social media lit up with messages of support and gratitude. She became a symbol of endurance, a quiet reassurance to everyone who had ever felt beaten down that resilience was possible. Now, as she prepared to welcome her baby into the world, Catherine drew on the same quiet fire that had carried her through every trial of her royal life. She moved forward, not because she felt invincible, but because she understood the power of simply continuing for her children, her husband, and herself. She became, without question, the warrior princess her nation didn't even realize it needed. Her courage inspired a nation, and when the news broke, the world couldn't hold back its tears. When hope returned to the palace, the world wept with joy, and felt Diana's spirit come home. The moment the news finally broke, it swept across the globe with a force no one could have prepared for. What began as a whisper inside the palace walls erupted into a chorus of celebration that stretched far beyond Britain. Headlines flashed in every language, declaring "Hope returns" and "Diana reborn," as millions clung to this rare and precious light in a year clouded by uncertainty. Social media ignited instantly. Hashtags trending worldwide within minutes. Videos poured in of strangers crying in the streets, of families toasting in pubs, of crowds gathering outside royal gates just to feel closer to the miracle. This was no ordinary announcement. It was more than another royal birth. It was a moment of catharsis. The people who had endured silence, sickness, and fear alongside Catherine now felt their own burdens lifted as her story turned a page. The baby, growing quietly in her womb, became, for many, the embodiment of resilience, the proof that love can endure even the fiercest storms. For those who had watched William and Catherine endure heartache after heartache under the glare of public scrutiny, this news felt personal. It was as though their triumph was shared, as though the palace had given the world permission to hope again. The idea that this baby would carry the name Diana only deepened the connection. Across social platforms and in headlines, fans spoke of her as though she already belonged to them, a bridge between past and present, between loss and renewal. People began to imagine her standing proudly beside Charlotte, the two sisters bonded by something far greater than duty. Some even called them future equals two daughters who could carry forward their mother's quiet strength and their grandmother's unforgettable spirit. Speculation about her future role only added to the frenzy. Would she inherit Diana's compassion? Would she redefine what it meant to be royal in her own time? Would she bring the monarchy closer to its people than ever before? These were not idle questions. They carried the weight of longing for authenticity, for warmth, for the kind of humanity Diana once embodied and that Catherine now carried forward. But above all else, this baby represented a legacy reborn not just in name, but in meaning. She was a reminder that tragedy does not have the final word, that even the deepest wounds can give rise to something beautiful. Wrapped in love, protected by a family who had learned the hard way what really matters, she became the very symbol of everything the monarchy still aspires to be: enduring, human, and profoundly loved. As William and Catherine stand together as a father, a mother, a future king and queen, their miracle child carries not only their hearts, but the hope of a nation. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.